The courthouse doors felt heavier than they should have as I pushed through them, my hands trembling as I clutched the deed to 300 acres of Missouri farmland. At 18, I had expected to walk out of the orphanage with nothing but a duffel bag and a bus ticket to nowhere. Instead, I was holding proof that Gregory Edwards, a grandfather I never knew existed, had left me everything he owned. The lawyer, a kind woman named Barbara King, had explained it all in her office just minutes before. My grandfather had been searching for me since I was placed in the system at age 3. He had hired private investigators, contacted social services, even traveled to different states following leads that went nowhere. By the time he found me, lung cancer had already started its final assault on his body. He spent his last months writing letters he knew I would never receive while he was alive, letters that were now sitting in a manila envelope tucked under my arm. I had never imagined that the moment I aged out of Riverside Children's Home would also be the moment I discovered I had family. Real family. Not the rotating cast of social workers and temporary guardians who had shaped my childhood, but someone who had actually wanted to find me, who had left me something more valuable than money. He had left me a place to belong. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to get incredible, and I want to share this journey with all of you. But standing on those courthouse steps, holding that deed, I felt more lost than ever. 300 acres in Millerville, Missouri. I had never heard of the place. I had never lived anywhere but cities, never seen a farm except in movies. The social worker who had driven me to the lawyer's office was already pulling away from the curb, her job officially complete now that I was legally an adult. I watched her taillights disappear around the corner and realized I was more alone than I had ever been, even with a grandfather's inheritance in my hands. The bus ride to Millerville took 6 hours and cost me $47 of the $63 I had saved from my part-time job at the orphanage. I spent those hours reading and rereading the lawyer's paperwork, trying to make sense of what I had inherited. The property included a main house built in 1928, a working barn, 2 equipment sheds, and what the documents described as fertile crop land currently leased to neighboring farms. There were also debts, property taxes owed, maintenance costs, and something called a lien that Barbara King had explained I would need to address within 90 days. The letters from my grandfather remained unopened in the envelope. I was not ready to hear from a ghost, not yet. I needed to see this place first, needed to understand what he had left me before I could face whatever words he had written in those final months. Millerville turned out to be the kind of town that existed mostly as a wide spot in the road between 2 larger places. The bus dropped me at a combination gas station and diner called Murphy's, where a hand-painted sign advertised the best pie in 3 counties. It was nearly sunset when I stepped off the bus, my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and that manila envelope tucked safely in my jacket pocket. The woman behind the counter at Murphy's was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her name tag read Betty Walker, and when I asked about directions to the Edwards place, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to something more complex. "You must be Henry," she said, not really a question. "Your grandfather talked about you all the time. Said you had his eyes." I did not know how to respond to that. I had never thought about whose eyes I might have inherited. In the orphanage, you learn not to wonder too much about where your features came from or who you might resemble. It was easier that way. Betty gave me directions to the farm, which was apparently only 2 miles outside of town, and offered to call someone to drive me out there. But I wanted to walk. I needed time to think, time to prepare myself for whatever I was about to find. The road to the Edwards farm was paved for the first mile, then turned to gravel that crunched under my feet in the gathering darkness. I had never experienced quiet like this. In the city, there was always noise, always the hum of traffic or the distant sound of other people living their lives. Here, the only sounds were my footsteps on gravel and the wind moving through what I would later learn were soybean fields. When I finally saw the house, it was smaller than I had imagined, but more solid. 2 stories of white painted wood with a wraparound porch that looked like it had been built for sitting and watching the world go by. There were lights on inside, which confused me until I remembered that Barbara King had mentioned a caretaker, someone my grandfather had hired to maintain the property until I could claim it. The front door opened before I could knock, and a man about my grandfather's age stepped onto the porch. He was tall and lean with weathered hands and the kind of face that suggested he had spent most of his life outdoors. This was Scott Davis, though I would not learn his name until later. In that moment, he was just a stranger standing between me and whatever my grandfather had left behind. "You are Henry Edwards," he said, the same way Betty had, like there was no question about it. "I am," I replied, not sure what else to say. He studied me for a long moment, then stepped aside to let me pass. "I have been waiting for you," he said simply. "Your grandfather asked me to look after things until you got here. Come on in. You must be hungry." The inside of the house was nothing like what I had expected. I had imagined dust covers and emptiness, the kind of abandoned feel that comes with death and absence. Instead, the rooms were clean and lived in, with furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive, and walls covered with photographs I was not ready to examine too closely. Scott led me to the kitchen where he had apparently been making dinner. The smell of something savory filled the air, and I realized I had not eaten since morning. He served me a bowl of stew and a thick slice of bread that tasted like it had been made from scratch, then sat across from me at a wooden table that showed decades of use. "Your grandfather hired me 5 years ago," he explained as I ate, "after his wife died and he started getting sick. I live in the apartment above the barn, help with maintenance and keep an eye on things. He told me you might not know what to do with this place at first, asked me to help you figure it out if you wanted. I did not know what I wanted. I had spent 18 years learning not to want things too much, not to get attached to places or people who might disappear without warning. But sitting in that warm kitchen, eating food someone had prepared for me, I felt something I had not experienced in a long time. I felt like I might be welcome somewhere." The next morning, Scott showed me around the property in the pale light of early dawn. The barn was bigger than the house, built from the same white-painted wood, but with a metal roof that caught the morning sun. Inside, it smelled like hay and motor oil and something else I could not identify, but would later recognize as the particular scent of a place where work gets done. There were tools everywhere, organized with this kind of precision that spoke of someone who took care of his equipment. Tractors that looked like they had been maintained rather than just used. Workbenches covered with parts and projects in various stages of completion. It was clear that my grandfather had been the kind of man who fixed things himself, who believed in taking care of what he owned. The fields stretched out beyond the barn, 300 acres of rich Missouri soil that Scott explained had been in the Edwards family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather had bought the land during the Depression, when farms were failing and property could be had for almost nothing if you had cash and were willing to work. He had passed it to my grandfather, who had spent 40 years building it into something profitable and sustainable. Now it was mine, and I had no idea what to do with it. The lien that Barbara King had mentioned turned out to be more complicated than I had understood. My grandfather had borrowed money against the property to pay for medical treatments that insurance would not cover. The bank was willing to work with me, Scott explained, but I would need to prove I could make the payments or find a way to pay off the debt entirely. The neighboring farmers who leased most of the cropland were good people, Scott assured me, but their lease agreements were up for renewal at the end of the year. If I could not demonstrate that I was committed to keeping the farm operational, they might look for land elsewhere. And without the lease income, I would have no way to pay the property taxes, much less the lien. That first week, I felt like I was drowning in information and decisions I was not prepared to make. I had never balanced a checkbook, much less managed a business. I did not know the difference between soybeans and corn, could not tell you when to plant or when to harvest. The adult world I had been thrust into felt impossibly complex, and the weight of my grandfather's legacy pressed down on me like a physical thing. But Scott was patient in a way that reminded me of the best counselors from the orphanage, the ones who understood that some lessons could not be rushed. He taught me to read the account books my grandfather had kept, showed me how to interpret the lease agreements and tax statements. More importantly, he helped me understand that I did not have to figure everything out immediately. "Your grandfather did not build this place overnight," he told me one evening as we sat on the front porch watching the sun set over fields I was still learning to see as mine. "He made mistakes, had bad years, learned as he went. The important thing is that he never gave up on it." It was during that first week that I finally opened my grandfather's letters. There were 12 of them, written over the course of his final 6 months, each one dated and sealed in its own envelope. The first one was the hardest to read. Dear Henry, the first letter began, I do not know if you will ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I have been looking for you for 15 years, ever since I learned that my son had a child he never told me about. I know that sounds impossible, but your father and I had not spoken in years when he died. Pride, I suppose, the kind of stubborn foolishness that runs in the Edwards family. I learned about you from a lawyer who was settling your father's estate. By then you had already been in the system for 2 years, and the social services people would not tell me anything. They said it was better for you to have a fresh start, that reopening old wounds would not help anyone. Maybe they were right, but I have regretted not fighting harder every day since. The letter went on to explain in things I had never known about my family history. My father, whose name was Ethan Edwards, had left home at 18 after a fight with my grandfather about money and responsibility in the future of the farm. He had moved to the city, gotten married, started a family, but he had also started drinking. And when my mother died in a car accident that he caused, he had not been able to handle the guilt or the responsibility of raising a child alone. My grandfather had tried to find me after my father's death, but the system had already moved me twice, and the records were sealed. He had hired private investigators, contacted lawyers, even driven to different states following leads that turned out to be dead ends. By the time he finally located me at Riverside Children's Home, I was 17 and he was dying of lung cancer. The subsequent letters chronicled his final months and his preparations for my inheritance. He wrote about the farm, about the neighbors I would meet, about the challenges I would face, and the resources I would have to meet them. But mostly he wrote about regret and hope, and the kind of love that persists even across years of separation and silence. I wish I could have known you as a boy, one letter said. I wish I could have taught you to drive the tractor, shown you how to read the weather, helped you understand that this land is not just dirt and crops, but a legacy that connects you to something larger than yourself. I hope that when you stand in these fields, you will feel the presence of the men who worked them before you, who believed that taking care of the land was the same as taking care of the future. Reading those letters was like discovering a family I had never known existed, but it was also painful in ways I had not expected. My grandfather's love for me was evident in every line, but so was his frustration at the years we had lost. He had wanted to be part of my life, had fought to find me, had spent his final months preparing a gift he would never see me receive. The last letter was different from the others, more practical and immediate. In it, my grandfather had included specific instructions for my first months on the farm, along with the name and phone number of his lawyer, his banker, and several neighbors who had promised to help me if I needed it. He had also included a key to a safe deposit box at the Millerville Community Bank, where he had left additional documents and what he described as emergency funds. But the final paragraph of that last letter was what stayed with me long after I had finished reading. It said, Henry, I do not know what kind of man you have become, but I know you have Edward's blood in your veins, and that means you have the capacity for both great stubbornness and great love. This farm has been in our family for 3 generations because the men who came before you understood that some things are worth fighting for. I hope you will decide that this place and the legacy it represents is worth fighting for too. You are not alone even when it feels like you are. You have a family history that stretches back beyond your father's mistakes and my failures. You have a place in the world, and that place is here. The safe deposit box contained $23,000 in cash, along with insurance policies, property deeds, and a collection of photographs that told the story of the Edwards family going back 4 generations. There were pictures of my great-grandfather breaking ground on the original farmhouse, my grandfather as a young man standing next to the first tractor he had ever owned, and dozens of photos of my father as a boy working alongside his father in fields that were now mine. But it was the most recent photographs that affected me most deeply. They showed my grandfather in his final years, often standing alone in the same fields where he had posed with my father decades earlier. In these pictures, he looked smaller, more fragile, but his expression was one of quiet determination. These were the photographs of a man who was preparing to pass something important to the next generation, even though he had never met that person. The money was enough to pay off the lien and cover the property taxes for several years, But Scott warned me that it would not last forever if I could not find a way to make the farm profitable. The lease income from the crop land would help, but it was barely enough to cover basic maintenance and utilities. If I wanted to keep the place long-term, I would need to find additional sources of revenue or learn to farm the land myself. That was when Scott suggested I meet Ethan Sanchez, a young farmer about my age who had been renting 40 acres on the south end of the property. Ethan had grown up on his family's farm just outside of town, but he was looking to expand his operation and had been hoping to lease additional land from my grandfather before he died. Ethan turned out to be everything I was not: confident and knowledgeable about farming, comfortable with the rhythms of rural life, connected to a community that had known his family for generations. But he was also generous with his knowledge and patient with my questions. When I explained my situation, he offered to teach me the basics of crop farming in exchange for a long-term lease on additional acreage. Our partnership began that fall with the soybean harvest. Ethan brought his equipment and his crew, and I provided what he generously called assistance, though it was really more like supervised observation. I learned to operate a grain truck, to recognize when crops were ready for harvest, to understand the complex dance of timing and weather that determined whether a season would be profitable or not. More importantly, I learned that farming was not just about crops and equipment and financial calculations. It was about being part of a community that understood the value of hard work and mutual support. When Ethan's combine broke down in the middle of harvest, 3 neighboring farmers showed up within an hour to offer equipment and labor. When a sudden storm threatened to damage crops that were not yet ready to harvest, the entire community mobilized to help each other cover what could be covered and salvage what could not. I had never experienced anything like this kind of collective effort. In the city, in the orphanage system, you learn to be self-reliant because help was not always available when you needed it. Here, self-reliance was important, but it was balanced by an understanding that everyone needed help sometimes, and that helping others was not just a kindness, but a practical necessity. By the end of my first harvest season, I was beginning to understand why my grandfather had fought so hard to find me, why he had been willing to spend his final months preparing a place for me in this community. The farm was not just land and buildings and financial obligations. It was a way of life that connected me to something larger than myself, something that had been missing from my 18 years in the system. Winter on the farm was different from anything I had experienced in the city. The quiet was deeper, more complete, broken only by the sound of wind through bare trees and the occasional lowing of cattle from neighboring farms. Snow fell in amounts that would have shut down city services, but here it was simply part of the seasonal rhythm that governed everything from equipment maintenance to social schedules. Scott used the winter months to teach me skills I had never needed before, but would be essential if I was going to make the farm work long-term. I learned to repair small engines, to weld metal, to read electrical diagrams and plumbing schematics. My hands, which had been soft from years of indoor living, developed calluses and scars that marked my transition from observer to participant in the physical world of farming. But the most important lessons were not about equipment or crops. They were about community and responsibility and the kind of long-term thinking that was required to maintain something across generations. Scott had worked for my grandfather for 5 years, but he had known the Edwards family for much longer. He remembered my father as a boy, remembered the fights that had driven him away from the farm, and the regret that had haunted my grandfather in later years. "Your father was not a bad person," Scott told me one evening as we worked on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a winter storm. "He was just young and impatient, and maybe too much like his father for either of them to see it. Your grandfather could be stubborn, set in his ways, convinced that his way was the only right way to do things. But he learned from his mistakes with your father. That is why he left you choices he never gave his son." The choices Scott was referring to were outlined in additional documents I had found in my grandfather's desk. Plans for different ways the farm could be developed or modified to meet changing economic conditions. My grandfather had researched everything from organic certification to agro-tourism to direct market vegetable production. He had not wanted to lock me into a single approach, but had instead provided me with options and the resources to pursue whichever direction seemed most promising. As winter turned to spring, I began to understand that inheriting the farm was not just about receiving them, something valuable. It was about accepting responsibility for maintaining something that was bigger than any individual owner. The land had been productive for 3 generations because each generation had made decisions based not just on immediate needs, but on long-term sustainability. This became clear when I met with the banker who held the mortgage on the farm. Janet Ortiz was a practical woman in her 50s who had known my grandfather for 20 years and had helped him navigate the financial challenges of farming through good years and bad. She explained that my grandfather had always been conservative with debt, always planned for bad weather and poor markets, always maintained reserves that would allow him to survive temporary setbacks. The farm is in good shape financially, she told me during our meeting that spring. Your grandfather paid off the original mortgage years ago, and the lien is manageable if you are committed to making it work. But farming is not just about having good land and adequate financing. It is about having the patience and persistence to weather the inevitable bad years and the wisdom to make good decisions when times are good. She offered to help me develop a long-term business plan, something that would allow me to maximize the farm's potential while maintaining the financial stability that my grandfather had worked so hard to achieve. But she also warned me that farming was not a business for people who needed immediate gratification or guaranteed outcomes. Some years you will make money, she said. Some years you will lose money. The successful farmers are the ones who understand that it averages out over time as long as you make good decisions and do not take unnecessary risks. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. The lease agreements with neighboring farmers were up for renewal, and I had to decide whether to continue the existing arrangements or try to farm more of the land myself. Ethan Sanchez had been encouraging me to consider taking over additional acreage, arguing that I had learned enough during the previous harvest to handle more responsibility. But farming additional acres would require significant investments in equipment and inputs, along with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from years of experience. It would also mean accepting full responsibility for decisions that could affect the farm's profitability for years to come. I spent weeks walking the fields with Ethan and Scott, learning to read soil conditions and evaluate drainage patterns, understanding how different areas of the farm responded to various crops and management practices. My grandfather had kept detailed records going back decades, notes about which fields performed best in wet years versus dry years, which crops were most profitable under different market conditions, which management practices had proven most sustainable over time. These records were like a conversation with my grandfather, a way of understanding his thinking and learning from his experience, even though we had never met. They showed me that successful farming required not just hard work and good intentions, but careful observation and continuous learning. Every field was different. Every year brought new challenges, and the decisions that worked in one situation might not work in another. It was during this period of decision-making that I met Betty Rivera, a woman about my age who had grown up in Millerville but had left for college and was now returning to help her family with their own farming operation. Betty was everything I was not: confident in her knowledge of agriculture, comfortable with the business side of farming, connected to networks of young farmers who were experimenting with new approaches and technologies. She was also kind enough to include me in informal gatherings where young farmers shared information and supported each other through the challenges of starting or expanding agricultural operations. These gatherings usually took place at Murphy's Diner or in someone's barn, and they reminded me of study groups from school, except that the subjects were soil fertility and crop rotation and equipment maintenance rather than math and history. Through Betty and her network, I learned about programs that provided financial assistance to beginning farmers, about markets for specialty crops that might be more profitable than traditional corn and soybeans, about sustainable farming practices that could reduce input costs while maintaining or improving yields. But I also learned that farming was not just about production and profitability. It was about stewardship, about maintaining the health of the land for future generations, about being part of a food system that connected rural producers with urban consumers in ways that were mutually beneficial. This broader understanding of farming's role in society helped me see my inheritance in a different light. The farm was not just an economic asset or a place to live. It was a responsibility that connected me to both the past and the future, to the generations of Edward's men who had worked this land and to the people who would depend on food produced here long after I was gone. By late spring, I had made my decision. I would take over farming an additional 100 acres myself, while continuing to lease the remaining land to established farmers who could manage it more efficiently than I could at this stage of my learning. This approach would allow me to gain experience gradually while maintaining the farm's financial stability and productivity. The decision to farm additional acres myself meant that I needed to invest in equipment and develop skills that would allow me to plant, cultivate, and harvest crops without relying entirely on custom operators or rental equipment. Ethan helped me find a used tractor that was old enough to be affordable, but new enough to be reliable, along with the basic implements needed for crop production. Learning to operate farm equipment was both easier and harder than I had expected. The mechanical aspects were straightforward enough, but understanding when and how to use different implements required the kind of judgment that could only come from experience. Ethan was patient with my questions and generous with his time, often working alongside me during critical periods like planting and cultivation. But the most valuable lessons came from making mistakes and learning to recover from them. I planted soybeans too early one spring and had to replant when a late frost killed the seedlings. I cultivated corn too aggressively and damaged root systems, reducing yields in those areas. I waited too long to harvest soybeans in one field and lost quality when an early rain caused some of the crop to sprout in the pod. Each mistake was expensive and frustrating, but each one also taught me something important about timing and observation and the complex interactions between weather, crops, and management practices. My grandfather's records became even more valuable as I gained the experience necessary to understand what he had been documenting all those years. By my second harvest season, I was beginning to feel like I belonged in the farming community in ways that went beyond simply owning land. I could participate in conversations about market conditions and weather patterns, could offer help to neighbors who were facing equipment problems or labor shortages, could contribute knowledge and experience rather than just receiving instruction and assistance. This sense of belonging was reinforced when the community faced a crisis that required collective action. A severe storm system moved through the area in late summer, bringing hail and straight-line winds that damaged crops and buildings throughout the region. My farm was fortunate to sustain only minor damage, but several neighbors lost significant portions of their crops and faced the prospect of financial hardship. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Farmers who had been spared major damage shared equipment and labor with those who had been hit harder. Local businesses extended credit and deferred payments. The community pulled together in ways that demonstrated the practical value of the mutual support networks that I had been learning to appreciate. I found myself in the unfamiliar position of being able to help rather than needing help. My equipment was available for neighbors who needed to replant damaged fields. My labor was available for cleanup and repair work. My resources could contribute to the collective effort to help everyone recover from the storm damage. This experience of being able to give back to the community that had welcomed me was profoundly meaningful in ways I had not anticipated. For 18 years, I had been the recipient of help from others, dependent on systems and institutions and individuals who provided for me out of professional obligation or personal kindness. But I had never been in a position to reciprocate, to contribute to someone else's welfare in ways that made a meaningful difference. Helping my neighbors recover from storm damage was not just about practical assistance. It was about becoming part of a network of mutual support and shared responsibility that extended far beyond individual self-interest. It was about understanding that my success was connected to the success of the community as a whole, and that the community's success depended on each member's willingness to contribute according to their abilities. By the end of my second year on the farm, I had established routines and relationships that made me feel more settled than I had ever been in my life. The morning chores of checking equipment and planning the day's work had become as natural as breathing. The seasonal rhythms of planting, cultivating, and harvesting provided a structure that was both predictable and constantly changing, depending on weather conditions and market factors. But it was the unexpected challenges that taught me the most about resilience and adaptation. When commodity prices dropped significantly in my third year, I had to find ways to reduce costs and improve efficiency without compromising the long-term health of the operation. When a key piece of equipment broke down during a critical period, I had to quickly arrange alternatives while learning to perform repairs that I had previously left to professionals. These challenges were stressful and sometimes overwhelming, but they were also opportunities to develop confidence and competence in ways that would not have been possible under easier circumstances. Each problem I solved independently, each crisis I navigated successfully, added to my sense of belonging, not just in the community, but in the role of farmer and landowner. The transformation was not just practical, but personal. The uncertainty and rootlessness that had characterized my childhood and adolescence had been replaced by a deep sense of connection to place and purpose. I knew every field on the farm, understood the quirks and characteristics that made each area unique. I could read weather patterns and soil conditions, could anticipate problems and opportunities based on subtle changes in crops or equipment performance. More importantly, I had developed relationships that went far beyond the transactional interactions that had characterized much of my earlier life. Scott Davis had become not just an employee, but a mentor and friend whose knowledge and experience were invaluable resources. Ethan Sanchez had evolved from teacher to partner to trusted advisor, whose judgment I relied on for major decisions. Betty Rivera had become someone I could talk to about both the practical challenges of farming and the broader questions about purpose and direction that everyone faces as they transition into adulthood. The community as a whole had accepted me in ways that I had not thought possible when I first arrived, with nothing but a duffel bag and an inheritance I did not understand. I was no longer the outsider who needed constant help and instruction. I was a contributing member of a network of mutual support and shared responsibility. This acceptance was formalized when I was asked to serve on the board of the local farm bureau chapter, a role that involved representing the interests of area farmers in discussions with government agencies and agricultural organizations. It was a responsibility that required not just knowledge of farming practices, but understanding of policy issues and political processes that affected rural communities. Accepting this role was both an honor and a challenge. It meant that my neighbors trusted my judgment and valued my perspective enough to ask me to represent their interests in important decisions. But it also meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that would affect people I cared about, decisions that could have consequences extending far beyond my own operation. The board work introduced me to issues and perspectives that broadened my understanding of agriculture's role in society and the economy. I learned about trade policies that affected commodity prices, environmental regulations that influence farming practices, and technological developments that were changing the nature of agricultural production. But I also learned about the political and social challenges facing rural communities, from declining populations and economic opportunities to infrastructure needs and access to services that urban areas took for granted. These broader challenges provided context for understanding why farming was about more than just producing crops. It was about maintaining viable rural communities and preserving ways of life that had sustained generations of families. 5 years after inheriting the farm, I found myself in a position I could never have imagined when I stepped off that bus in Millerville with $63 and no idea what I was walking into. The operation was not only financially stable, but growing, with additional land rented from neighbors who were retiring or reducing their farming activities. The equipment was newer and more efficient, purchased with profits from good years and careful financial management. But the most significant changes were not measured in acres farmed or dollars earned. They were measured in relationships built and responsibilities accepted, in knowledge gained and confidence developed, in the transformation from someone who needed help to someone who could provide help to others. The farm had become more than just a place I lived and worked. It had become the center of a life that was connected to community and purpose in ways that gave meaning to both successes and setbacks. The seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest provided structure and continuity. The daily challenges of equipment maintenance and crop management provided opportunities for problem solving and skill development. The relationships with the neighbors and business partners provided support and accountability. Most importantly, I had discovered that belonging was not something that happened automatically or immediately. It was something that had to be earned through consistent effort and demonstrated commitment. It required not just receiving help from others, but finding ways to contribute to the collective welfare of the community. This understanding was reinforced when I received a letter from a social worker at Riverside Children's Home asking if I would be willing to speak to teenagers who were preparing to age out of the system. The social worker had heard about my story through connections in the legal community and thought that sharing my experience might be helpful for young people facing similar transitions. The request forced me to reflect on the journey that had brought me from that children's home to this place of stability and belonging. It had not been easy or straightforward. There had been moments of doubt and frustration, times when the challenges seemed overwhelming and the learning curve impossibly steep. But there had also been moments of breakthrough and achievement, times when I felt the satisfaction of mastering new skills or solving difficult problems. Speaking to those teenagers was both humbling and inspiring. Their questions reminded me of my own fears and uncertainties during those first months on the farm. Their hopes and dreams reflected the same longing for belonging and purpose that had motivated me to persist through the difficult periods of adjustment and learning. But I also realized that my story was not just about individual determination and hard work. It was about the power of community support and the importance of institutions and individuals who were willing to invest in someone else's success without expecting immediate returns. My grandfather had left me more than land and buildings and financial resources. He had left me a place in a community that valued hard work and mutual support, that understood the importance of helping newcomers find their footing and develop their potential. Scott Davis had provided not just employment but mentorship and friendship. Ethan Sanchez had shared knowledge and opportunities that accelerated my learning and development. Betty Rivera and her network had provided social connections and professional relationships that broadened my perspective and expanded my opportunities. The community as a whole had been patient with my mistakes and generous with assistance during difficult periods. They had judged me not by my background or initial ignorance, but by my willingness to learn and contribute. They had given me time to prove myself and opportunities to demonstrate my commitment. Today, as I write this story, I am looking out over fields that are green with the promise of another harvest. The corn is shoulder high and healthy, the soybeans are flowering right on schedule, and the weather forecast suggests favorable conditions for the next several weeks. It is the kind of morning that reminds me why my grandfather fought so hard to find me, why he spent his final months preparing this inheritance. But the view from my kitchen window includes more than just crops and equipment. It includes the barn where Scott Davis is already at work, maintaining equipment and planning the day's activities. It includes the field where Ethan Sanchez is experimenting with cover crops that might improve soil health and reduce input costs. It includes the road where Betty Rivera drives past each morning on her way to her own farming operation, often stopping to share information or coordinate activities that benefit all of us. This network of relationships and shared responsibilities has become the foundation of a life that is both personally satisfying and economically viable. The farm provides not just income, but purpose, not just a place to live, but a reason for living that connects me to something larger than individual self-interest. The teenager who stepped off that bus 5 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a manila envelope full of legal documents could never have imagined this transformation. I had expected homelessness, had prepared for a life of uncertainty and struggle, had assumed that aging out of the system meant facing the world entirely alone. Instead, I discovered that family was not just about blood relationships or legal documents. It was about shared values and mutual support, about people who were willing to invest in your success and accept your contributions to their welfare. I found that belonging was not something you inherited, but something you earned through consistent effort and demonstrated commitment. The farm taught me that security was not about having enough money or owning enough assets. It was about being part of a community that valued your contributions and supported your efforts to build something worthwhile. It was about understanding your role in systems and relationships that extended far beyond individual self-interest. Most importantly, I learned that legacy was not just about what previous generations left behind. It was about what you contributed to future generations, about how you used the opportunities and resources you had been given to create value for others. My grandfather's letters, which I still read occasionally, were not just communications from the past. They were invitations to participate in something ongoing, something that connected me to ancestors I had never met and to descendants I might never know. The farm was not just my inheritance, it was my responsibility to the future. As I finish writing this story, I want to share it with all of you who might be facing your own transitions and uncertainties. Whether you are aging out of foster care, starting a new career, moving to a new community, or simply trying to figure out where you belong in this world. I want you to know that belonging is possible, even when it seems impossible. It requires patience with yourself and others, willingness to learn from mistakes, and commitment to contributing rather than just receiving. It requires understanding that community is built through countless small acts of mutual support and shared responsibility. If you are watching this from your own place of uncertainty, I encourage you to look for opportunities to contribute rather than just asking for help. Look for communities that value the things you care about. Be patient with the process of earning trust and building relationships. Most importantly, do not give up on the possibility that you can find your place in the world, even if that place is nothing like what you expected. I would love to hear your stories of finding belonging in unexpected places. Share them in the comments below, along with where you are watching from around the world. Subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share it with anyone who might need to hear that home is not just where you come from, but where you choose to build your future. The sun is coming up over the Edwards farm, and there is work to be done. But it is good work, meaningful work, work that connects me to the past and the future in ways that make every day feel like a gift rather than just another obligation. That is what my grandfather left me, and that is what I hope to pass on to whoever comes after me.